BioCentury This Week is brought to you by IQVIA Biotech. For biotech companies striving to bring innovative therapies to market and maximize patient impact, IQVIA Biotech is the trusted CRO of choice. Backed by 25 years of unparalleled experience and deep therapeutic expertise, our full-service clinical development solutions are purpose-built to accelerate success. IQVIA Biotech helps early-stage biotechs de-risk by developing strategic clinical development plans, guiding drug candidates along the most promising pathways. Leverage data-driven models and dynamic tools to craft a compelling value story and maintain momentum through every phase of drug development.
After years of falling behind in the obesity race, Pfizer is back in the game with a $5 billion acquisition of obesity startup Metsera. We'll take a look at the deal and what it does for Pfizer's chances to catch up to Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Also on the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, UK Science Minister Patrick Vallance agrees that UK drug pricing needs a fix, but he's confident industry can come back to the table. We'll discuss why. And Donald Trump's deadline for nearly 20 biopharma companies to make drug pricing concessions is rapidly approaching. We'll get the take of the new chair of Bio on the scramble to avoid international reference pricing, and former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb warns against restricting in-licensing drugs from China. Finally, what's next for narcolepsy? We look at the data from the World Sleep Congress in Singapore. I'm Jeff Cranmer, one of the executive editors here at BioCentury, and today I am joined by
Simone Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Steve Austin, Washington editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
All right, we have a packed podcast for you, and it's good to have the team back. We had a lot of folks over at Grand Rounds, our debut Grand Rounds on European soil over in the UK in Cambridge. But first, if you could redesign FDA from the ground up, what would it look like? That's the fundamental question underlying the 2025 BioCentury Back to School essay, authored by our very own Steve Austin, our Washington editor. Steve has been a leading voice on regulation and policy for nearly 3 decades now. If you're interested in reading Back to School, visit BioCenturyBackToSchool.com for immediate access to the 8-part series. That's if you're a subscriber. If you're not yet a subscriber but are interested, a complimentary trial to BioCentury awaits. It's available via the same link, BioCenturyBackToSchool.com, and that will grant you access to the in-depth data and analysis, which is essential for navigating today's rapidly evolving sector. You'll get the Back to School report and a lot of other cool stuff, including what we're about to talk about on this podcast, and that is Pfizer making its comeback in obesity. Stephen, you wrote that Pfizer's kind of been in the game before, but kind of fell out of it. What happened, and why is Metsera, this 3-year-old startup, the thing that's going to put Pfizer back on the map?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So you're right. Pfizer they were at one point one of the leading companies in obesity with respect to the small molecule race. So small molecules for a GLP-1 agonist. They had been developing a program called danuglipron, but they ran into some tolerability issues with that program. And it was also, at the time, it was formulated as a twice-a-day pill, which I think they finally realized was not really a commercially competitive profile. So they ditched that for a follow-up program. But then that one ran into issues. So that one ran into some liver toxicity issues, as we sometimes know from these small molecule assets. And so then they moved back to danuglipron, this time looking to reformulate it as a once-a-day pill, which they did. They moved that into phase 3. But then earlier this year in April, they announced that they were discontinuing that program. also due to liver toxicity issues. So they've had multiple goes at it in the small molecule side, but they didn't really get into the injectable, peptide side of the obesity sort of competitive race as of yet. But clearly, obviously, despite the setbacks that they saw with their oral GLP-1s, this is a pretty big move to try and sort of catch them up and get them back into the race.
Deal terms, I think $4.9 billion in enterprise value, and then there's some contingent value rights. Stephen, is that correct? That if those all hit, and that's not always the case if you've been following the CVR space, but if they do, I think the deal would be over $7 billion. Am I correct in that, Stephen?
Yeah, no, that's about right. It's it's $4.9 billion up front, so that's what everyone's going to be getting straight away. And then you're right, based on sort of if there's phase 3 trial start, I believe, for the combination, plus if they hit on a couple of approvals, it could be another more than $2 billion on top of that for the CVR. So it's a pretty hefty option on top of that. But sort of getting back to your question about sort of why Metsera, I mean, I think, obviously it's early, but the data that we have seen have been pretty impressive. So they have kind of two lead injectable programs, MET-097, which is a GLP-1R agonist. But the early data we have for that, so they have 12-week data out from that program that showed 11.3% placebo-adjusted weight loss, which is pretty good for 3 months, especially for a GLP-1 only agonist. And then they also have an amylin agonist, MET-233, which showed 8.4% placebo-adjusted weight loss after just 5 weeks, which, if that were to continue to trend down, that's potentially a best-in-class amylin asset. So you have those two, showing pretty strong efficacy early, plus the way that the programs are formulated, they're getting pretty long half-lives, so they're looking at potentially moving to once monthly dosing, which would be pretty strong so far in terms of a commercial profile. And then on top of that, they have other follow-on programs. So they have a prodrug of the GLP-1 that they're saying could be even longer than once a monthly dosing. And then they have an oral program as well. We've talked on this podcast quite a bit about some of the challenges with the oral peptides in obesity. A lot of that revolves around the fact that they're once daily oral peptides and they come at pretty high doses. And so there are some real questions around how scalable those are from a commercial standpoint in terms of whether you could really manufacture enough API to supply a market like obesity when you're talking about 50 or 100 milligrams per day of a peptide. But what Metsera, at least preclinically, thinks kind of sets their oral program apart is that it has sort of a much higher potency, better bioavailability, and sort of an enhanced uptake technology that they think kind of combined, at least according to their modeling, they think they can get sort of a 92% lower dose as compared to, like, for instance, 50 milligram oral semaglutide, which Novo had tested in phase 3, but decided not to bring forward to the regulators because they just thought it was too high of a dose to be able to, be able to manufacture. So Metsera thinks that it has an oral platform that, despite being a peptide, they think could be commercially viable just from a manufacturing scalability perspective. So I think that's pretty intriguing because, I if people would have picked up on, I've been pretty skeptical, let's say, of the chances for an oral peptide in obesity, but if the data they have holds, it could be a pretty interesting story.
And where is this one in the clinic, Stephen?
Yeah, so the most advanced program is the MET-097, so that's the GLP-1 agonist. They're supposed to be before this deal, Metsera was expecting to announce phase 2b data this month, with more phase 2b data coming early next year, which would likely set that program up, if everything was positive, to move into phase 3 sometime next year. And then they've got the amylin program is also in phase 1-2, and a couple others that are moving as well. So I think there are 4 clinical programs in total that are being tested right now. So should those phase 2Bs read out quite well, I mean, that gets Pfizer right back into phase 3 pretty quickly, which I think, is a pretty intriguing opportunity for them.
Yeah, and this is one of those companies that gets you excited about biotech. Founded in 2022, based in New York City. The company had announced 2 private fundings totaling over $500 million. That was last year, went public in January. And, it hasn't been easy sailing for IPOs this year, but they've done well. They priced at 18. Share price went up as high as 47.40.
Yep.
And who'd we have in this? Was it Arch, Stephen?
Yeah, this was one of Arch company launched it, and I think there was others like Population Health Partners was in there as well as Fidelity. But yeah, as you say, the takeout price is about 10 cents higher than their all-time high that they traded at this year. So it basically gets a takeout at what had been their all-time high, basically. Plus, then you have the CVR as sort of the upside. Frankly, I was a bit surprised, given that Metsera was really one of the stronger, I think, obesity companies out there. But maybe they just got a deal where they just thought this was too good to be true.
Well, it's got to be tough for these independents to go toe-to-toe commercially with Lilly and Novo.
No, I think that's a good point, Jeff. I think that's something else is, the amount of money that needs to be invested in these companies, not only to run the phase 3s, but then to invest in the manufacturing, especially if you're a biotech, or the amount of money that you would have to spend trying to, get access to a CDMO. And I know that's already a pretty competitive space, trying to buy up CDMO spaces in peptide manufacturing. So, it might have been just a situation where Metsera just looked at it and said, given the amount of money that we would need to invest to be competitive, maybe we're better off, taking this deal with Pfizer and having Pfizer make those investments where there's, maybe they have a better chance of really being commercially competitive here.
Stephen, who else should folks be watching among the independents? I know we have Zealand. They have that big deal with Roche. Anyone else out there?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think if we're thinking strictly on M&A, it might take them off the board just because, as you mentioned, they had that $1.6 billion upfront deal with Roche for their amylin program. Similarly, Gubra had a deal with AbbVie, pretty sizable deal. But others to note, I mean, I think, there's obviously still a lot of attention on Viking Therapeutics. And then after that, a couple other privates to, consider. There's Verdiva, which is doing injectable and oral therapies. There's Kylera Therapeutics, which also raised, I think, over $400 million in their launch as well. And then, maybe a little more if you're thinking of companies working in obesity that aren't just obesity companies, but that might be, looking at the muscle-sparing areas. You could think of a company like Scholar Rock, which looks like they're on the verge of probably having a commercial product for SMA, but then also, look like they're moving towards late-stage testing for a myostatin inhibitor for obesity. So just a couple of the names to keep your eye on.
Sounds good, Stephen. Thanks for that. And I know a quick shout out to our colleague Paul Bonanos, who contributed to the piece. We're going to go to a quick break, and then we will be back to bring in Simone to talk about what's going on in the UK.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 12th China Healthcare Summit in Shanghai. From in-licensing to new co's, cross-border deals from Asia are transforming global biopharma. Meet top decision makers and investors at the 12th China Healthcare Summit to explore emerging opportunities and tackle key challenges in this rapidly evolving landscape. Join us in Shanghai October 22nd to 24th to get a first-hand look at China's dynamic life sciences ecosystem. Register and learn more at biocenturychinasummit.com.
We are back, and partnering opens this week for our 12th China Healthcare Summit in Shanghai, scheduled for October 22nd to 24th. Register now at biocenturychinasummit.com and start scheduling your meetings so you have a full dance card when you arrive in Shanghai. You can send me a message on LinkedIn if you want to apply to present as a presenting company. We have a great class. Sobi will be there, Hua Medicine, quite a few other from the West and from China. You can also send a message to me or my colleague Josh Berlin on LinkedIn if you're interested in joining the China Summit tour of Shanghai's Zhangjian Park. It is quite a sight to behold. And we hope to see you in Shanghai, or you can register for Digital Pass if you can't make it out this year. We are going to turn to the UK now. Simone, you just came back from the motherland. Our third grand rounds meeting happened at your old stomping grounds, Cambridge. And how did the meeting go? And give us a few of the highlights before we dive into what the science minister is saying.
Thank you, Jeff. I will certainly go in a little depth in a couple of minutes to what Patrick Vallance, who is the Minister for Science, spoke about in a very good fireside chat with Kate Bingham of SV Health Investors and former chair of the COVID vaccine task force. Other highlights, we had a great opening keynote by Steve Jackson, who's, of course, a pioneer in the DNA damage response. And, I have to tell you, it was followed by a really good debate. The debate was with Steve Bates and Jerome Van Beervliet. And it was on the topic that I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is, is this the UK's biotech moment? And obviously, there was some news in the week before that really put a lot of that into doubt. Lots of really good energy. What I want to say is that the UK got some sort of body blows in terms of big announcements. Merck deciding to pull back on $1 billion R&D facility it had, I think, broken ground on. Now not going to build that in London. AstraZeneca and Lilly following that with announcements saying they're also reconsidering their investments in the country, and Sanofi piled in there as well. So, when we talk to people, that was kind of certainly a very big blow. But on the other hand, you wouldn't know it from the energy. Like, there's just tremendous energy. People really talking a lot about their science. There's really a very high level of engagement between scientists, between investors, farmers. I mean, the meeting was focused on translational bottlenecks. And once we weren't talking about the policy issues, it was incredible, actually. So people are not walking around with long faces at all, actually. They were pretty optimistic about their science and their potential to actually translate that science.
Oh, that sounds brilliant, Simone. I've been hearing rave reviews from some of the folks that helped connect us with some of the presenting companies who were there. And I appreciated you sending me pictures of the Buttery and other cool spots where we held the meeting. But tell me a bit about this fireside chat you had with Patrick Vallance and Kate Bingham.
Right. Well, they call him Lord Vallance over there, but we don't do that at BioCentury. And she's Dame Bingham. We don't do that either. Just to make it clear, Kate Bingham knows Patrick Vallance very well. And so it was really a very frank, she did not hold back from asking him the difficult questions, but it was a very frank, he was very open. He was very articulate about their policy. And, he has a background from GSK. He worked there for over a decade. And for about 6 years or so, he was head of R&D. So he really understands the issues. The issues are as such, and I know Steve agrees with me on this, these farmers who are saying they're pulling back investments because there's not enough investment in UK life sciences and listing a panoply of reasons. Steve, I think we agree. This is all about drug pricing, right?
It is, obviously. I mean, the other things are important, but I always say when people say it's not the money, it's the principle of the thing, it's the money.
Yeah.
and that's what it is here. So I want to cut to the chase. Patrick Vallance said that he agreed that something has to be done in the UK so that NHS spends more on drugs. The other way to look at it is so that they claw back less. The question I have is, does he have the power to make that happen? He's the science minister. He's not the finance minister. He's not the head of NHS.
Okay, so he obviously doesn't have the power to make that happen. But what is clear to me from conversations with various people who were in attendance there is at least that the government has taken notice. So I was hearing that Rachel Reeve, who's the chancellor, was sending messages saying, sort of explain this to me and so on. So this is not something that has only gone as far as Patrick Vallance, okay? This is certainly going all the way to the top in terms of understanding its importance. It was all over the papers there. I will say, though, that in the days that I spent with my family and friends who are not in our ecosystem, they had no idea. So I'm not sure that the general public really knows. But, I think the main point is that Patrick Vallance said that he is on the phone to Pascal, that's Pascal Soriot, of course, who's CEO of AstraZeneca, that there are a lot of backroom conversations going on right now. He categorically said that he thinks they can bring industry back to the table on this. I don't think anybody thinks that Merck is going to restart digging its $1 billion facility that it pulled back on. And that's, as we've talked about, partly on Merck. The real question, Steve, it's not just that Patrick Vallance doesn't have the power. It's really, where is the money going to come from? If the money's got to come from somewhere, if they're going to spend more on drugs. And industry's contention, which is correct and true, is that NHS spend has gone down to 9% of its spend being on drugs, where it used to be 14 or 15%, and that's what peer countries are at. And so they're like, it's completely unacceptable that this is your level of spend, and why would we carry on investing there? So the question is, how are they going to change the VBAC scheme?
And I would interrupt and say, it's not just a matter of the amount of revenues that pharma and big biotech companies are making in the UK. It's also patient access to drugs. I think patient access to drugs in the UK arguably is worse than it is in peer countries, certainly worse than it is in the United States. And the other thing I think that's important that Patrick Vallance said in the interview, and we've got the story, everybody should read it, he acknowledged that there are geopolitical concerns that are affecting the UK, in particular, the demands from the Trump administration that companies invest more in the United States and that they demonstrate their commitment to the United States by investing in manufacturing, investing in R&D in the United States. And, like I said in the last time that we talked about this, it's a zero-sum game. If companies are investing more in the United States, unless their global markets are increasing, global revenue is increasing, which for many of these companies certainly isn't the case, they're going to have to cut back somewhere. So for the UK to be competitive, to get a piece of that action is going to become increasingly difficult, and they're going to have to make it worth it to these companies.
Right. And so, you wrote about that previously, like Merck at the same time as pulling back in the UK has invested a certain amount in the US. But to your other points, okay, this is an area where I actually do think Vallance can have some influence. And that is talking about clinical care, talking about patient access. He was quite articulate about getting community hospitals and more patients into clinical trials, and that being a key and core parameter for the NHS. He talked a lot about data and how they're going to be creating a £600 million health data research service, which is sort of going to be run as a government company, but is actually independent from government in the way it operates. It'll have its own CEO and everything, but it's sort of a non-profit. So the money will get sent back to the NHS, and it's going to be used to enable hospitals throughout the NHS to get access to appropriate levels of anonymized data, and for people in the NHS themselves to be closer to the innovation enterprise and actually innovating themselves. And he talked about 2 AI-based research computing resources that they've opened. There's a lot of things going on beyond this question of the negotiations over the drug pricing.
And there's also the things that I spoke with Lawrence Talon about, that we talked about, MHRA trying to expand its reach globally, trying to be more innovative. It's interesting. We're going to talk about this later in the podcast, because Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, was trying to position the argument for reforming FDA as being something that's going to make the United States more competitive in terms of the competition with China. It sounds like in the UK, they're trying to make a similar argument. They're saying, we can do regulatory reforms, and regulatory in the UK means both approvals or reviews of medicines, but also the pricing, because the pricing is part of the regulatory scheme there. So they're saying that they can make themselves more competitive and attract companies there. It's really a debatable proposition as to whether countries are going to be able to innovate themselves out of the problem that they have in terms of competition from China. I think that the Chinese have got certain structural advantages and certain competitive advantages, and they're not going to let go of those. I'm not sure that the things that are being done in the West are of a magnitude that they're going to offset them. I would also say that my contention is that they don't need to, that there's room in the world for innovation no matter where it comes from, and that probably the best policies are going to be those that promote innovation wherever it comes from and promote access for patients to that innovation.
Right. So, Steve, I actually wanted to say this. For the UK, there's 3 names that people should remember. One is Patrick Vallance, the other is Steve Bates, the other is Lawrence Talon. Sorry, everybody, 3 guys, but still. So having Patrick Vallance, everybody I spoke to is very enthusiastic, feeling that somebody in this position of influence really understands the industry. This is a Labour government, which is not a particularly farmer-friendly government, but it's got probably the best advocate they could have in that position. The second one is Steve Bates, who is moving into the Office for Life Sciences, where, again, these are very difficult things. I don't know if anybody can do it, but if anybody can, Steve's the person, just to understand how you pick up the phone to person A and person C and person E, and understand that those people need to understand certain issues in order to move them from one position to another. Again, Steve really understands the ecosystem. And the third person, we'll see what he can achieve. Again, Lawrence Talon, whom you interviewed, people have a very positive impression of him heading up MHRA. So there's no lack of good ideas. And your points about China is exactly what Vallance says. He's like, we don't need to compete with them on everything. We need to figure out what we're really good at and compete on that and deliver on that. Innovation can come from everywhere. We need to work out. He's put in more aggressive goals, actually. For MHRA, they've talked about 150 days. Vallance says he doesn't think that's actually fast enough, right? So, hopefully that's the starting point.
That's for getting trials started.
That's for getting trials started. And we all know that one of China's biggest advantages is the speed at which people can start trials there. So understanding that the NHS is kind of very broken, but at the same time, a potential jewel in the crown. Again, I do think that having smart people who understand the ecosystem, let me put it like this, it's the best chance they've got. Doesn't mean they can do it, but they're better off than without those people in place. So I'm interested to see how that unfolds.
No, I think it's fascinating. And also, just to add on to what you said, one thing, which what you're saying basically is that they're kind of hyper networked, right? Everybody in the UK who's involved in doing science, in promoting innovation, and creating public policy around this, they all know each other. They all understand each other. And now they're trying to work on the same page to promote something that's going to make life sciences a pillar of their economy.
Right. And they're doing it with a very good substrate where they really have a lot of biotechs and a lot of innovation. So let's see. We'll see where it goes. I don't think it's easy, but I do think it's exciting.
Well, and good news for our listeners if they want to tuck into this more. We have a 2-part Q&A that we'll begin publishing today. That's Monday as we record this. Part 2 will come out soon after. And it is the Q&A with Patrick Vallance and Kate Bingham. And it is good stuff. All right, let's stay with the policy and head over to Washington. Steve, biopharma companies are under pressure from a September 29th deadline, that's next Monday, to propose concessions to the White House in hopes of avoiding what is being called most favored nation price controls. Steve, you sat down with the new chair of Bio. What did you learn?
So I spoke with Fritz Bittenbender, who, as I said in my introduction to the interview, he's really wired into Washington's life sciences public policy scene. He's the senior VP for Public Affairs and Access at Genentech, and he's chair of Bio. Before joining Genentech about 9 years ago, he was the executive vice president of public affairs at Bio. So this has really been his life for a long time. First thing he said, industry believes that President Trump's September 29 deadline for companies to come up with voluntary steps to comply with his request for MFN pricing is a real deadline. Fritz gave some insight into how Roche and Genentech are approaching this, and he confirmed my reporting that the administration has refused to negotiate with Bio or Pharma. So Roche is making proposals for a more competitive Medicare Part B market, which is interesting because, of course, Genentech's a big Part B company, is a company that has a lot of biologics. They're also making proposals for reforming Part D in ways that narrow the gap between list and net prices. And they're presenting other ideas that Fritz said will create savings for patients and taxpayers, but he conceded they aren't MFN. I'm hearing that other companies are taking a similar approach. I'm also hearing concerns from some of the companies that one or more of their peers, there are 17 companies that are speaking with the administration. And by the way, by the administration, I mean pretty much Mehmet Oz, the head of CMS, who's heading up these negotiations. So anyway, there's a concern that one of these companies is going to break ranks and offer to comply with the administration's MFN demands. If that happened, the White House could use it as pressure on the other companies. Even if it doesn't, it's pretty smart policy for the administration to request negotiations separately with each one of these companies. They can't coordinate with each other because of antitrust concerns. The administration can take something that one company has offered, a concession, another concession that another company has offered. It can aggregate these and say, okay, well, we'll put them all into a big package and we'll try to apply them to the entire industry. That could be what happens. If there isn't some kind of an agreement, what Fritz Bittenbender said and what I'm hearing is that the most likely response from the Trump administration will include some kind of so-called demonstration project, which would be mandatory from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation at CMS. That could be for Part D, that could be for Part B, or it could be for both. It could be some further attempt by the administration to impose MFN pricing on Medicaid. And Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has said that tariffs could play into this somehow as a way to get MFN pricing policies imposed in the United States. Should also say that one of the other things that's going to come out of this, and we're seeing some announcements already, is that companies are going to start announcing that their European pricing is going to be closely aligned with their U.S. pricing. It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. You know, are those real prices or are those going to be list prices, and the companies and the countries that they're negotiating with will have some kind of undisclosed discounting or rebating or something like that. We don't know how that's going to work. That's going to be really an interesting thing. Kind of summing it all up, look, we've got another week. I expect that some of these deadlines, sometimes when we hear these deadlines from the Trump administration, they're not real. They kind of get blown off and things happen a little bit later than has been promised. That may be the case here, but what I'm hearing is, at least from the company side, they believe that this deadline next Monday is a real one, and that we should hear probably one from the companies, what it is that what kind of concessions they're willing to make, and two, from the Trump administration, whether they're willing to accept those or whether they're going to impose some other kind of measures that are intended to lower the prices of drugs in the United States and perhaps to increase the prices that are paid in other countries.
And of course, our podcast listeners should tune into our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show, where Steve and Simone and sometimes me sits down with a key opinion leader like Fritz and discusses key issues such as this. And another key issue that we are watching quite closely here at BioCentury is the Biosecure Act. Steve, I know you asked Fritz about it. What did you learn?
So there's a new version, kind of a modified version of last year's Biosecure Act that is being introduced in the Senate. There's an effort to try to get it as an amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act. And I asked him whether Bio endorses it. They did endorse the Biosecure Act last year. He said that Bio didn't have a position yet on it, but it sounded to me like it's likely that Bio at a minimum won't oppose it. The key differences between this one and what was rejected last year is that instead of naming specific companies, the amendment sets up a process for identifying companies that would be national security concerns. And like last year's bill, then it has about a 5-year grandfathering period for companies that have contracts with those companies that are identified as national security concerns to define alternative service providers. And it imposes a ban on U.S. contracting and grant-making to entities that rely on companies that are identified as biotechnology companies of concern after that grandfathering period is over.
Okay, Steve, another important voice in the policy world, former FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb. He's on Pfizer's board, I believe, a couple of others. And he is also a partner at NEA, He warned on Friday that restrictions on in-licensing medicines from China could trigger what he is calling an international IP arms race, one that would undermine U.S. industry and public health. Steve, what prompted his warning?
Scott was speaking at the USC Schaefer Center's DC campus. It was a meeting about a report that the Schaefer Center has put out about ideas for reforming FDA, which, by the way, is a very interesting report and has a lot of good ideas in it. So he said that FDA reforms are needed to make the U.S. competitive with China. As an aside, Janet Woodcock was in the audience. She was on a later panel, and she kind of spoke up and she pushed back and she said to Scott, well, your ideas are good, but FDA reform should be separated from discussions of China. The two really aren't linked either on a policy level or intellectually. And Scott, it was really funny. He said to everybody in the audience, he said, well, now you see what my morning staff meetings used to be like when I was at FDA. So one of his points was to warn against imposing restrictions on in-licensing drugs from China. And he said that it could provoke, as you said, an arms race, an IP arms race, in which other companies would impose restrictions on U.S. IP. And he mentioned that, of course, the United States, U.S.-based companies sell an awful lot of IP or license an awful lot of IP around the world and would be hurt by restrictions on doing so. He also noted that some really important drugs have been and are being developed in China, and that it would harm American patients to be denied access. And he cited Legend's CAR-T for multiple myeloma, which J&J acquired, and which he said, is stupendous for patients.
Okay, so Gottlieb's been pretty outspoken about the IP situation. What are we hearing other people say? And, what do you think are the chances that this kind of policy is actually going to, stick, that it's going to stay? Do you think they'll roll it back?
So the origins for a lot of the concern on this issue are a New York Times story from a week or two ago, where they got a hold of a draft executive order that's been floating around the White House, which calls for creating a system for intensifying scrutiny of in-licensing of medicines from China, and perhaps subjecting them to some kind of a process like the CFIUS process that's used to scrutinize and in some cases prohibit Chinese investments in the United States. I don't doubt that the draft executive order that the Times reported about is real. I haven't seen it. I've tried and I haven't been able to get a copy of it. As far as I know, nobody else has, but it's most likely that that draft was created. I think there's a lot of draft executive orders on a lot of topics that are floating around the White House, and a lot of them aren't going to see the light of day. The Times reporting said that Peter Thiel and a company that's associated with Kushner are pushing this idea. They're saying that competition from China threatens to harm American biotech companies, and this is a way to kind of level the playing field.
Let me go back to what I said about the UK, because what was rare there is, we know there's a lot of people walking around government who really just don't understand the ecosystem. And it seems to me that those arguments indicate a lack in, certainly with respect to this ecosystem. And, how much purchase does people like Scott Gottlieb and those kind of voices, how much influence do they have?
Well, he's quite influential, but there's also a tremendous amount of agreement, bipartisan agreement, Democrats and Republicans, that the U.S. should take steps to protect American industry from China. So, protectionism is a popular concept in Washington right now. There's a great deal of interest in disengaging or disentangling U.S. technology companies from China. I think that there's a spillover from the national security debates around semiconductors and AI technology in China. One of the things that I think happens in Washington a lot is that policymakers who understand one area very well, or at least believe that they understand it very well, like semiconductors or AI, assume that what they know about those areas apply to other areas that are adjacent. And that happens a lot with biotech policy because there aren't a lot of people in Congress who really understand biotech policy. There are a few, but there aren't very many. There aren't very many people in the White House who do, and they're kind of drowned out by some of these other voices. That's where I think that somebody like Scott Gottlieb speaking out very publicly, and by the way, there's an op-ed that he has in the Washington Post today about this. I think that it does have influence it raises these issues and it makes people start asking questions.
All right, and you can find Steve's story on biocentury.com. There'll be a link in the show notes. And let's see. Hey, let's head to the clinic. Singapore hosted the World Sleep Congress, and Lauren had the opportunity to dig into some cool data that's coming out for narcolepsy. The two leading companies, Takeda and Alkermes. Lauren got to speak with the ageless Richard Pops, as well as a key member of Takeda's team. Takeda, the company that cracked the code on orexin agonist. Lauren, do I have that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. It was a good piece, Lauren. What did you learn?
Thanks, Jeff. So I learned that this is really a milestone year for narcolepsy because of how this class is advanced. So at the meeting, which was over a week ago now, we learned that Takeda's therapy met the primary endpoints and the secondary endpoints in a pair of phase 3 studies. And we also have phase 2 data from Alkermes. I think overall, this just helps provide validation for this idea that you can agonize the orexin 2 receptor and have an impact on not just wakefulness, but on some other, symptoms that come along with narcolepsy type 1. The reason that this was particularly interesting is that this is a disease that has had approved therapies, but they don't really get at the underlying biology in the same way as targeting the orexin 2 receptor does. So patients with narcolepsy type 1 are lacking the neurons that produce the orexin neurotransmitter. And we can't just add back that neurotransmitter in a therapeutic form for several reasons. It's a large protein. It needs to cross the blood-brain barrier. And then designing an agonist has been challenging because of some of the same problems. And also the fact that you need to kind of replicate the rise and fall of levels of this neurotransmitter in a patient's brain to help them, have a normal sleep-wake cycle. So Takeda was the first company to sort of have a breakthrough in this class after many ups and downs and some failures. So I think this is a big moment for that program in particular. And I think there are a lot of eyes on this field because it's not just these two that have had some clinical success. There are several others that have moved into the clinic as well. Right now, I think there are questions about which one of these might end up being best in class. So Takeda is ahead. It's looking toward regulatory submissions this year. There are questions, there are side effect profiles that are common to both therapies in this class and potentially the other ones that come forward too. There are questions about dosing. So Takeda's therapy is dosed twice a day. Alkermes so far in the phase 2 trial was dosed once a day, which may be more convenient for patients, but Takeda is arguing that twice daily dosing is potentially a path to better efficacy because of the way that you want orexin not to just continue to rise throughout the day before you reach time to sleep, when it should fall off quickly.
Lauren, you spoke to Sarah Sheikh, head of global development and SVP of the Neuroscience Therapeutic Area Unit at Takeda. And on that point, I thought it was kind of cool what she was saying. It was like the patient could almost like figure out what works best for them based on what they're doing on a certain day. Like, if you have a big meeting or whatever, you can kind of plan when you take that second dose.
Exactly. So you can control the interval between your two doses based on, how long you want to stay awake for that, or how long you want to have full wakefulness for that day and what you have later in the evening, for example. So I think that, it makes sense.
What else? You also wrote that they're exploring other indications. What other indications are they digging into for these?
Sure. So narcolepsy type 1 is the indication where there actually is a loss of orexin. There is another type of narcolepsy where orexin is present, but we still have the same issues, symptoms with sleep. So that's another area where both of these companies and some others are testing orexin 2 receptor agonists. In some cases, it's different agonists that may act on the receptor in different ways because orexin is present in these patients. It's just not working, potentially not working as that should be. There are also some other sleep disorders where modulating this pathway could have a therapeutic effect. And then there are a lot of thoughts about other conditions where wakefulness, cognition, mood, the types of symptoms that are associated with narcolepsy that, orexin 2 receptor pathway activity are not sort of the primary symptom associated with that disorder, but are problematic for patients. So, I think ADHD, for example, was proposed as a potential indication where this class of drugs could have sort of more of a symptomatic effect for patients and something that they're exploring.
Interesting stuff, Lauren. Pops and Shake, both very optimistic that there's an opportunity to really build franchises around orexin assets. So we'll be keeping an eye out. I know Takeda has other assets in the clinic, preclinical as well. We'll be continuing to watch this space. Some other stuff to check out on our website. Stealth finally got its approval for Barth syndrome. It's been a roller coaster 10-year journey. Steve and I collaborated on a piece that published Friday. We also have our colleague Paul Bonanos' story on Lazard's M&A survey that they did with top biopharma executives. And as I mentioned earlier, check out Steve's conversation with Fritz Bittenbender of Genentech, who is the chair of Bio. And keep an eye out for 2 more podcasts this week. We'll have the recording of Stephen Hansen and Simone on stage in Cambridge, wrapping up the Grand Rounds Conference. So joining Simone and Stephen, James Sabry, of course, the prolific deal maker at Genentech, Roche, now BioMarin, and Michelle Jones. Simone, good stuff?
Always good stuff, Jeff. I recommend people listen to it if they want to get the skinny.
And we'll also be doing a podcast, Lauren and I and Selena, once she gets off the plane from the UK, we'll be sitting down with an AI expert from podcast sponsor IQVIA. So look out for those 2 podcasts this week. Thank you for tuning in. If you like what you're hearing, please like and subscribe. And a special thanks to Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for BioCentury this week and the BioCentury show. Tickets are now on sale for the group's 8th season. So if you're in the greater Boston area, go check it out and enjoy a relaxing evening of wonderful music.
BioCentury would like to thank IQVIA Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. Learn why IQVIA Biotech is proud to be the go-to CRO supporting biotechs from innovation to patient impact. Visit IQVIAbiotech.com.